So I'm Christine Henry. I'm a senior technical healthcare business analyst at London's Air Ambulance. And I'm going to talk to you today about one of the projects within our digital transformation, specifically about moving various helipad operations, equipment checklists, and equipment tracking from sort of paper and the physical world over to digital. So as a sort of how it started, how it's going, we were on laminated checklists and physical whiteboards. Now we're on app checklists and some cases QR codes for equipment scanning. So London's Air Ambulance as a charity, it exists to do a 24-hour service within the M25, helicopters by day, fast response vehicles, cars in the evening. And the aim is really to bring the hospital to the patient. So it's doctor and paramedic teams, the most severe trauma cases, and really medical procedures that were traditionally only done in hospitals. They helped 1,494 patients in 2020, kept going all through the pandemic and lockdowns, was founded in 1989 and has helped over 40,000 patients on the emergency side since then. And traditionally, the charity has been very, very clinically innovative. It still is. You know, there's a lot of clinical research done. They're world leading in bringing some of these procedures outside the operating theatre and to the roadside, essentially, for the first time. But in operations, there is perhaps more opportunity for innovation, shall we say. And just to say that LAA as a service is actually a three-way partnership between London's Air Ambulance, the charity, which provides the funding, supplies the helicopters and does the sort of aviation administration. Barts Health NHS Trust officially employs the doctors and does the clinical governance for all the patients that we treat. And also the helipad is on the 17th floor of the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. And then the London Ambulance Service, the paramedics come on secondment from there, and they also provide the dispatch when there is a job. So that's the sort of background to the charity. In terms of the digital piece, and this is specifically concentrating on the sort of healthcare and clinical side of the digital, not the funding and donor CRM sort of part. In 2019, before I joined, they hired an external consultancy to develop a digital transformation strategy, knowing that we had some work to do. As part of that, there was a digital maturity score. And you can see there that out of 5 in 2019, LAA scored a 1.3. The plan with the 3-year strategy is to get to a 2.9. So we're certainly not looking at being sort of the optimal level of 5. We're getting from an ad hoc to a sort of standard and managed digital and data use. There are key strategic goals in that, including around patient care and digital patient records, data sharing with hospitals, both sort of as the patient is coming in and in terms of linked data afterwards for follow-up and tracking the success of interventions. And then also this piece around a digital workforce, which includes things like better rota management, better documentation and training management for the people who are coming in on 6-month secondments. And then also the piece I'm talking to you about today about equipment and checklists. So there's nothing wrong with paper checklists. They can work very well. They don't need the internet. We're certainly not looking for a tech solution for tech's sake. But I think some needs were emerging which suggested that this was something that is valuable to spend time on. One of those is simply sort of a duplication of effort and unnecessary effort. So with the paper checklists, if they did need to be recorded, a doctor or paramedic who presumably has better things to do had to go and scan that to send to an email address. Someone had to get it from the email address to save in a drive, things like that. It was also not the depth of data information. So if you had a case and you wanted to look at, was the car fully checked before they went to that case, or was the bag done? That information wasn't available. It was also impossible to see opportunities for learnings. You know, you don't have the data to start to say, well, this item is missing an awful lot, so maybe we need to change our process of ordering it. And I think also the non-real timeness. So the whiteboard that you can see there is situated on the 17th floor up at the helipad. The cars are down on the ground floor. If you get down to a car, realize there's a mechanical fault and you have to move the bags across to the spare car, there's no way of changing that on the physical whiteboard. So for those reasons, it was decided this was valid to pursue. Why now, though, with all of the other digital strategy parts? And that's really down to COVID. This wasn't the top priority, but there was a quick reassessment last year, and I joined the charity on day one of lockdown, by the way. I can take no credit for this. The advantage of this project is that it's self-contained for the LAA charity. There's no patient data, so we don't need to talk to our NHS partners to set up new data sharing or new data systems at a time that they were heavily under the pump. All of that's going on, but in the background. Remote development was possible, and we did require that of the third-party developer teams that we requested for proposal. It is not without its drawbacks, which I'll get to later, but it does work. And then I think the last thing there is that it is visible and useful tools for the whole team, who were also, remember, under pressure from COVID and keeping the service going through lockdown. These were checklists and apps that they could immediately pick up and use, not just the doctors, not just the paramedics. It hit the pilots and the fire crew as well, and would be immediately useful versus something like changing patient data sharing, which has value, but perhaps in a bit of time and might even require more work. But the ultimate goal is always tying it to the key aim of the charity, which is to improve patient care by saving the team time, letting them spend time on higher value tasks, and starting to collect data to let us learn and generate improvements. So I've done the why now. One thing I want to stop and do here is a bit of a why not responsible tech check. And I think this should increasingly be part of all of this sort of talks. And also my other hat is that I'm sometimes a data ethics consultant and worked with the Data Kind Ethics Committee. So I have an interest in this. I've put up the Ethical OS ethics outline there. There are a zillion ethics frameworks out there and responsible tech frameworks. The ODI has one that's called the Data Ethics Canvas, if it's more of a data project. Some are focused more on algorithms. This is fine for us. And I think also I'm pretty lucky. This project had very few ethical issues. We're not using patient data. The staff data is stuff that they were providing already, as in who's done a check, and you know that because they're on shift. No one's trying to sell anything. No one's trying to surveil anything. I think perhaps the biggest risk from a tech perspective, which probably sounds familiar to some of you, is that the tech makes things worse. Rather than save time, we cost time. Something goes wrong and you miss an item from a checklist and patient care suffers. The way we manage that risk is twofold. I think first, a lot of expert input. We gathered together a group of what we call user champions from across the group, so pilots, fire crew, paramedics, and doctors. The sponsor of the project, my manager, Dr. Mike Christian, is also a HEMS consultant who regularly goes out on shifts. So very close to the product and aware if things were going wrong. And I think the other part of this is we were sort of so far back in the digital journey that you wouldn't know if it was costing more time or not. So in some ways, providing a baseline for future developments, whether it's high tech or low tech, is in itself a good. So we went ahead. So let's look at how that's worked out before jumping back into the process and what's underneath. So this is an example of one of the old paper checklists. It's an aircraft checklist for the clinical team, so not doing aviation safety, making sure that all the correct medical kit is on the helicopter when it takes off. This would traditionally be done as a two-person call and response checklist. So a bit of a side note here. I don't know if anyone's read the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande or his New Yorker article, but that's about surgical checklists which improve safety in the operating theatre. There's a long medical history of checklists to help with safety and equipment. There's also an even longer history in aviation. So in the helicopter emergency medical service, you sort of get both of those. So we've got a lot of these. There are over 20 documents, I think, just on the emergency medicine side that cover everything from specific bag checks and vehicle checks to things like the daily checks. Have you left the car keys somewhere? So we have a lot of these to do. We just had some examples here. And if you now look at a video I hope will play, this will be the app version of the same checklist. So you can see here, we're selecting the helicopter, we're selecting the type of check. This would still be two people, just one of them is holding an iPad now. You would go through and tick off each item. An advantage over the paper checklist as we go through and skip some is that if something is missing, there is the opportunity to mark that as missing and enter a free text comment as to what's gone on there, whether something's on order, whether they're okay to live without it. And then at the finish, you've got a record of that. You've got the team members who did it. And then that can be submitted, and in real time that goes into the data and connects with the rest of the list of the team processes. So that's the helipad checklist. The other thing I wanted to mention was equipment tracking. This is because when we did a user survey about 4 months into using these, this was the thing which most people saw as the biggest positive, that they now had real-time information. So before, it was 2 whiteboards in 2 different rooms on the helipad. One of them bag focused, one of them vehicle focused. So think of it as sort of pivot tables, but physical. And what we've now done is move to digital whiteboards. They are still scrolling through on a big TV screen on the helipad, but you can also get these on the iPads when you're down at the car or out on a job or whatever. And anecdotally, that's where people are using it most. So again, a bag focused one, a vehicle focused one with key information about equipment. And just to say here, the body armor sizes there is the important thing, which is stab vests because of the nature of some of the jobs the team goes to. Obviously, depending on who's on shift, you need different sizes of those. Really important that the right ones are in the car. So just to sort of tie into the reality of the job the team do. And then we also have a way to change where equipment is. In this case, we've focused on one particular car in the screenshot, HO4, everything in there. If you want to change it and move, you've moved a bag somewhere else, you can just edit from a drop-down menu. You also have a different app to scan QR codes, and that's a way to update the equipment in real time. So what's under the hood? So Microsoft and third-party developer. So technology is always situated in a context. In this case, the context is firstly that the charity recently got Office 365. We're trying to use Teams and SharePoint more and wanted to take advantage of these tools. And the other part is that in the history of LAA, there had been a couple of times when they were burnt by having bespoke technology built by small development shops or even individuals who then didn't have the bandwidth to maintain or improve it. Microsoft's not going anywhere, we're pretty confident, Bill and Melinda notwithstanding. And also these tools promised to be low code or no code that we could maintain in-house. And part of the ask from the third-party developers was that they left us something we could make changes to ourselves, because those checklists change a lot. You get extra PPE because of COVID, you change the brand of syringe, and now they've got to be packed somewhere else. It's a dynamic system. And so we're looking at PowerAutomate, Power Apps, and Power BI. I want to mention briefly that Microsoft also includes in their Power Suite a virtual bot creator. We haven't used that, and I can't tell you anything about it. Sorry. So if we look at Power Apps, you can see that there is a sort of no code, low code interface, and that's the sort of front end user facing bit. There are a lot of templates out there for standard users. Obviously, we have something that's a bit different, but I did want to show this to show that it does get down to exact pixels, exact font color. You can build out very advanced UI. What we've actually done is get a template from the third-party developer and use that. And even though templates aren't, everything always needs tweaking and each checklist has its own peculiarities, it's still a good basis to start with, even though pretty much every case I've had to do some fiddling myself. Also, just to say that it is possible to do Power Apps, for free in standard Microsoft licenses off Excel or SharePoint lists. We had some particularly advanced needs that meant we need to use the Dataverse, but also we have more advanced coding than a lot of the standard templates. For example, we needed to have an offline use and a way to save checklists offline because there's not internet everywhere the team goes. PowerAutomate is also something that feeds into the data and draws from the data. This is basically a sort of if this then that rules and task automation tool. It's something that gets senior stakeholders really excited. So I would say that, if you're trying to get these power tool things for your workplace, telling them that they can have automatic email notifications when someone joins or requests leave or whatever, it's a really good way to set that up. What are we using it for in the context of the equipment checks? We have an automated API pull for the Tower Bridge lift times from the Tower Bridge website. So when a user clicks a button in one of the Power Apps, they will get the bridge times, which is obviously important for the car travel part of the service. I've actually built a flow myself to save equipment locations to a static file every 12 hours. in case Power Apps becomes unavailable, you still have a reasonably recent snapshot of where most of the equipment was. We also have set up an automated email notification to the driving manager if a car gets listed as out of service by the team. They obviously should tell him so he can call a mechanic in or whatever. If they're rushing to a job, they may forget. This is sort of a backup. And we have alerts timed for driver retraining. So we're starting to use that more and not just within the apps. We also have what's under the hood of those, under the hood is the Microsoft Dataverse. It used to be called the Common Data Service. This is essentially a database plus logic plus security tool. The way IntelliJ, our third-party vendor, described it to us was that, you could build out the same data relations yourself in, say, a SQL server, but it would be a couple of months extra work to build all the logic and so on that you get for free by opting into Microsoft's system and using Azure to store the data and so on. So this means that essentially it's data all the way down. Rather than saying, here's a checklist, we're going to make it in a SharePoint list or a form or something. A checklist is simply a row in the checklist table, which is linked to the checklist items, the checklist submissions, as on this slide, and the checklist exceptions, what's missing. And those are all tied together, in a relational database sense. There's also some sort of user interfaces to add data in. And the reason that's important is I think the other advantage of using Dataverse is that it splits out the content of the checklists from the pretty app work. So we have some expert users on the helipad. We've set up the security permissions so some people can edit in the staging environment, and they can create new checklists. They can make any of those changes to checklists that they want, and that will update in the app automatically, which means that those users can work on the data side. They don't need to think about, oh, okay, now I have to change the pixel length of that row by 80 pixels because something has changed. You get a lot of that for free once it's set up with the interlinking between the Dataverse and Power Apps. So we have all this data. We're changing that. We're using it within the apps. We're using it within PowerAutomate. This is a data conference. I have to talk about the data reporting side, which is Power BI, which is probably the thing most of you are most familiar with, or most data people. So, a reporting tool, a data visualization tool, a dashboarding tool, whatever you want to call it. We're not sold on this, and you certainly don't need to use that. Once you have your data in those multiple Microsoft tables, it can be fed into any of the other tools that you like. But we've got Power BI for now. This is an example of a monthly dashboard. We're tracking the number of submissions. We're tracking, the number of equipment location changes there, over 500. You can see that even if not all of those were originally recorded in the manual whiteboard, that's still a lot of work for the team that hopefully has become more efficient by using a drop-down menu or using QR codes. And then we've got things like the most exceptions. So what is most often not done, so that we can start to look if that's a problem or if anything needs changing. And then, deeper dive into vehicles, which is often an issue. So this is data reporting from the start. And I think a lot of people say that it should be user-led and you should be responding to user questions. And in this case, this is equipment tracking. The users genuinely had not conceived of most questions about this data and didn't really think about getting it. It's not as important for them as the clinical. So we're really user-leading, I would say, but I think there's still some value in doing it. So the first thing we got asked about is certainly, rather than aggregate, individual data points. So the team has a method for improvement called clinical case audits, which is taking an interesting case that the team went to, looking at the whole process around that case and looking for opportunities for improvement. Everything from the 999 call, the process of leaving the helipad, the treatment, and then the aftermath. So we started getting questions like, what time was this pack last checked? Or was the team all present at the daily briefing? Or was the vehicle checked completely before the team went on this job? You can see most of that within the apps. There's also some things that are easier with the back end, but because we've enabled those data experts on the helipad who work with the team more closely, they can now do that themselves. And I have not been bothered by that question since month 1, which is fantastic. We want people to be doing it themselves. It's also a way to start seeing anomalies and outliers and having conversations. So, this question is getting missed a lot. Is that a matter of wording? Is that a matter of training of the new people? Is it that that's now irrelevant, and it could be removed from the checklist, but nobody told me about it? So you can start to have those conversations. I think another point 3 there is building familiarity with the metrics and possible insights for the equipment and checks. So this data. So you start thinking, well, how long should a checklist take to do? If we made a change and it took a minute longer, would that be acceptable or not? And then there's the more general team data maturity, senior stakeholder data maturity, starting to think about possible insights they could get when they have other data. So we have had questions like, can we get the same chart for length of time it takes you to do an equipment checklist, but for length of time it takes you to get to the patient side? You can. We have that data in slightly less accessible format, but we're starting to build it out. Again, history within the charity of using perhaps not the right vendor. And I think that's fantastic. Even if we have to say, no, we can't answer that yet, we don't have the data ready, or we need to get it from our partners, the fact that people are starting to think about that is still absolutely a win. So that's sort of the process. Now I want to go back and look at what we learned, how we did it, how we're finding it, and what makes this success. Because it has been successful so far, but I think nonetheless, there are certainly some learnings and things that I would change. So the launch process, first of all, how did we start this off? And the first thing I have on this slide is actually pre-launch. It was a very, very conscious choice in the development priorities to set the highest touch checklists, the bags that were repacked most often, the vehicles that everyone does, the daily briefings that bring the fire crew and the pilots in as well, so that everyone had a chance to use these apps on the iPads and get familiar with them. And that was a choice. We also built out training materials to be ready to go. So Dr. Christian made 1-pagers and also videos of the processes, because even though it's pretty intuitive, it's still good to show people. Third point is most important, but also hardest for most organizations. Team communication using the regular and familiar change process. Now, I don't know about you. Most organizations I've worked in before don't have a regular and familiar change process. But this is the strength of working with the clinical history and the aviation history. The team are very used to, a new clinical guideline comes out. So we're going to change the standard operating procedure document for how we do this procedure. Or we have a new brand of scanner. It has to fit somewhere else in the vehicle, so we have to redo that checklist. There's a process for that. There's a monthly meeting. There's what's called a team read file. So every time you're on shift, you will read about any changes or notifications. And the other part of this, I think, that's a real strength, is having 6 months secondments. There are always new people through being trained. They have to read the up-to-date documentation and be tested on it. The more senior people have to test them on it. So everyone's very aware of the up-to-date state of versions. And that's a really strong thing. So it means that when we said, these 5 checklists are going live on the 19th of October, you have to use them. People used them. There was no sort of holdout from someone who'd resisted for 20 years in finance because everyone moved on. It's not that there was no resistance. Some people still prefer paper, but there is a forum for that and a way to discuss it and a place to bring it up later if things aren't working. And that makes things a whole lot easier. It means you have resistance, but not refusal. And then the last thing we did to sort of really capitalize on that and show that was do weekly reporting initially rather than the monthly dashboard I showed you, to say, look, this many people have signed off on various checks. This many checks have been done. People are using this. And by doing that reporting, we even had a sort of names that have done it the most for the first couple of weeks, just to sort of get a bit of competition going. And that sort of brought up the familiarity as well. So things didn't stay running that smoothly. The first thing I want to talk about here is the limits of virtuality. And I know we're in a virtual conference. We're all feeling the limits right now. But I told you before that the live equipment tracking was the thing that got the most positive feedback in the survey. The thing that got the most negative feedback in the survey was about performance. The fact that sometimes the apps can take, sometimes over 10 seconds to open and be ready to use. The reason I say that this is something else to blame COVID for is that, the developers couldn't go to the helipad, have the limited internet, have the older devices and try that for themselves. I couldn't be on the helipad very often because of social distancing to try all that. Even the team testers were only meant to be there during their shifts, which meant they didn't have unlimited time to try things out. They were more concentrating on, does this checklist contain every item we need in the bag, rather than, does it annoy me so much I want to hurl the device against the wall? And that's fair enough, but it means that we're hitting this problem later. We've got to work on it now to try and respond to the feedback. The other place that I think virtual working is hurt is in prioritization, both raising priorities and lowering. So in terms of raising priorities, if you're there every day seeing people at work, you can see where they run into difficulties that they may see as so business as usual, they don't even mention it to you as a need, but you might see a way that tech can help. And I think we're missing that. In terms of lowering priorities, you know, I haven't been up to the helipad very much. I'm not as familiar with all of the people. I know they're paramedics and doctors who are on shift and going to save people's lives. And so sometimes I get emails like, oh, we've changed this checklist. And by the way, can we have it ready for the next shift that starts in 2 hours? And without having the situational awareness of having been there, it's quite difficult to know how real that need is and how much it can be pushed back on. And I think that's something you miss from not having the sort of close contact and in-person thing. Nonetheless, what that all leads to is that, yes, we've got a change process. It's great. It helped us bring the checklists in. Now the change process needs to change. You know, it used to be that if you were in the change meeting, you could literally type into the Word document, print it off after the meeting, boom, new checklist. Now the expert users can type in pretty quickly into the Dataverse backend, but that's in staging. Then the app should be tested. Then they have to tell me about it so that I can push through to production as a sort of, you know, guard on anyone making changes. And we have to find a time to do that that doesn't disrupt people. We also have to set the level of communication. You know, one line change, probably not worth it. Whole new checklist, probably worth it. There's a bit of fuzziness there about when you make changes and when you communicate. I would also add that the Microsoft tools I just showed you are not easy. We're all sort of learning as we go. You know, I've picked up things before, but there's more than one language within Power BI. Power Apps has functional programming, which as of March has a name and is being open sourced, but before that wasn't. PowerAutomate has its own sort of functions that you can use, but also has XML and JSON in the back end. And sometimes the only way to solve a problem is to use those. This is not pick up and go. This is, despite the low code thing, expertise helps. So we need to think about all of that. So, you know, while I said how it started, how it's going, all looks very nice. Sometimes it also feels like how it's going is, you know, a loading screen and a lot of error messages coming up in Power Apps that you have to decode. So where do we go next? And I think the big thing that sort of crystallized for me as I was writing this talk, thank you, is that taking all of that in, our initial assumptions won't hold. We initially said, okay, we can maintain it ourselves. We've got a template. Let's just make more checklists with that template and we'll be fine. We can move on to the next digital project in 2 months. Not true. Maintenance is not free and it takes time that was never consciously set aside for any of us. There was always hidden work of updating the paper checklists, but now it's made a bit more visible. The other part of that is that not only do the team make changes on the helipad, as they absolutely should, by the way, that shows we're improving. It shows we're refining the processes. But Microsoft also makes changes. Very, very trivial sounding example. On the morning I was doing my first expert user training for paramedics and admins up at the helipad, and I'd done lovely screenshots and everything. Microsoft had changed the name of everything. The Dataverse used to be the common data service. Tables used to be entities. Columns used to be fields. So all of a sudden, all our training documentation is out of date. And that takes time and effort to just maintain at a suitable level. It's fine. I'm sort of used to self-learning enough that I could go in and dig around. For people who are a bit scared of seeing code or doing things in a technical way that is not Excel, having those name changes can be really off-putting. And you know, there have also been cases where Microsoft has actually changed concrete things so that you have an answer on a forum that 10 people endorsed for 6 months ago doesn't work now because they've changed things. It's great that they're investing in this. It does decrease the stability. So there's time needed for maintenance that we haven't fully developed as a system. Maintenance isn't enough. That's the other part of this. You can't just say, okay, we've done our checklist, now we're fine. Partly, we always knew that new checklists would be needed. There was always planned improvement. The other thing is that once you start getting feedback from a very engaged team, be it about performance or wouldn't it be nice if we had this or something else, if you don't act on that within a reasonable time, you start to lose engagement, and that means you start to lose buy-in for the next possibly more painful technical innovation. So that's a real worry. And the last point I've got there is partnership and community. What do I mean by that? We've been talking as though we're just on our own. One of the things that we were lucky enough to have happen, because Intelligy proposed it to Microsoft UK, is that this project was chosen as one of the Microsoft UK blog case studies that go out quarterly. So it's one of 4 a year. It's interesting because it's a charity using things in slightly different ways. Intelligy did an article on it as well. I'm sure I can try and share the articles afterwards or come chase me up. That's great. It helps us get grant funding. It makes people at the charity happy for publicity. The other part of this is that we've been contacted by other air ambulances around the UK. Some of them are using Power Apps in different ways. Can we discuss that? Can we learn from each other? Some of them want to pick it up, which is fantastic. Barts Health, some of the departments are noticing this, and the NHS more broadly is moving to Office 365, and they're starting to get interested. The doctors are going back from their secondments or working their other jobs as other paramedics and seeing opportunities for these tools. That's a benefit for us regardless of mutual learning, because if the individuals can have a more consistent experience, start getting digital maturity in all of their workplaces, not just LAA, that's fantastic. But if you start thinking about what collaboration and learning from each other means, there are going to be opportunities for improvement. If we don't have a system set up for sustainability that includes ways to improve from external sources as well as feedback from our users, then we're going to be missing out. And that's where we're at the moment, building that system to allow us to improve this project, move forward on other projects, and keep the goodwill that we've earned, and ultimately, of course, improve patient care. So yeah, that's what we've learned. Use the strengths. You can't stand still. You have to move forward, and you need a plan for that. The other thing that I'd like to do as I finish and take some questions is acknowledge, of course, the patient, the reason the service exists, everyone on the helipad who filled in the tools and contributed feedback, especially the expert users who have taken time from their already full jobs to learn how to use this tech as well, which is fantastic. Obviously, the team at the charity who have done great things with sort of publicity, but also the senior stakeholder buy-in, providing funding for a third-party vendor. And then also the partners at LAS and Barts who have also helped. And then obviously Intelligy and Microsoft, we're still working with them both. I'm very happy to talk in more detail about any of the technical aspects or licensing aspects later, so please hit me up. And the final thing I say is join the team. Now, nothing to do with Power Apps. We're actually in the next couple of weeks going to be advertising for a data analyst position to focus more perhaps on the clinical data, things around looking at interventions, tidying up some of the data that's coming from London Ambulance Service and linking it to ours, and doing a bit of stuff around also things like time to job, locations of jobs, so a bit of geospatial. Probably not touching this equipment stuff at all, but if you're interested in general, then please do feel free to contact me and I can let you know when the job ad goes live. So with that, I'll throw open to questions and show you the lovely Microsoft cartoon as well. Let me see if I can find the questions we got. And thanks to whoever posted the link there. We have a question about the offline context. So yeah, I have to say that I have not had to work a lot with it myself. That came from the third party and the Intelligy, and we basically haven't changed the template. But yes, Microsoft Power Apps in its purest form is not designed to work offline. So while it can work, it's sort of not the optimal use case. You have to have a lot more, building in of collections and storing on devices and being able to call that back. So in terms of the lines of code written, yeah, the offline accounts for a lot of that. It seems to work okay. And for us, as I said, with kind of dodgy internet, some places it was essential. But if you think you can get by without it, then honestly, that would be my first choice before sort of trying to introduce the offline. Hope that's answered the question. Again, happy to follow up later. Good. Perfect question from Richard, because I literally meant to talk about this and forgot. The idea of third party. So we use the third party to start off for a few reasons, partly because, we had the funding And that's really important because it speaks to the value that senior stakeholders placing on this digital transformation. So it's not just we have the money, this is engaging with improving things for the team. The other part of it is that we knew we had a reasonably complex existing data set. We weren't sure whether to try and go the SharePoint lists aspect or go into the Dataverse common data service. And the risks of failure were reasonably high, in the sense that if you missed out an item and then patient care suffered, or you missed out an item and then a car broke down, there are real world consequences. So we made the choice to go with third party to set it up, but we really pushed hard for that to be maintainable by ourselves, for us to be able to build new checklists and radically change them. I don't think that's a common ask of them. And I think that, having me, who has a little bit of self-taught coding experience and was willing to give things a go, was really key to that. You need to have an expert in-house, or you need to have someone who's very, very willing to be an amateur, because it does take time. And that's something that we're still wrestling with, how to carry that on in the months ahead, when I and the other expert users also have full-time jobs doing other things. Hope that's answered that question. But yeah, absolutely, third-party developer helped with our initial work, certainly. If there are no other questions, no, there is another question. There we go, perfect. Power platform tenancy. Yes, so we set it up within the London's Air Ambulance sort of environment, within Azure. So the fact is that Dataverse sits on the Microsoft cloud. We have Office 365 already. There's some weird thing where if you buy enough paid Power Apps licenses, you get enough Dataverse chunk to use, which I'm not deeply technical in that part, so I'm not going to go any further into that. And because this is just the charity data, we're fine. We also want to use some Power Apps for patient data in the Barts Health NHS Trust. And while NHS Digital in principle supports that, that becomes a much more complicated question on where we land this and where it sits. And that one I don't have an answer to yet. So NHS patient data, whole other question. For the LAA charity, we hold it ourselves. I mean, there's a third-party IT department that the charity outsources things to anyway, who handle things like the Azure identities and creating user groups. But once that's set up, the data sits in there quite happily. And we have multiple environments as well: staging, production, test. I think that's at time, and there don't seem to be any more questions. So thank you very much, and feel free to get in touch with me later with any questions about this. I'm on Twitter, I'm on email. So really good to talk to you all this afternoon. Thanks.